The courtroom was silent as the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed with disbelief. "Why is this Marine still in jail?" she asked sharply. Moments later the doors burst open and what happened next left everyone in that room gasping in shock. James Walker never expected his life to fall apart on a quiet Friday night. He had served his country with honor to tours in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. He'd been decorated for bravery, respected by his fellow Marines, and loved by his small-town community. But none of that mattered when he stepped into a situation that spiraled completely out of his control. That evening, James had gone to a local bar just to unwind. He wasn't drinking heavily, just sitting in the corner with a beer, listening to the low hum of music and conversation. But then a fight broke out near the door. Two men were screaming at each other, pushing and throwing punches. James didn't want trouble, but instincts honed in combat took over. He moved to break up the fight. Just as one of the men pulled a knife, everything happened in a blur. James grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it until the knife dropped, and pinned him to the ground to stop him from hurting anyone. By the time police arrived, James was holding the attacker down, trying to explain what had happened. But the man he had disarmed started yelling that James had attacked him without reason. His words were slurred, but they stuck. James tried to speak up, to give his side, but the officers didn't listen. They saw a strong man holding someone on the ground and made a decision without asking questions. They handcuffed James and put him in the back of the squad car. The attacker was taken to the hospital, and James was taken to jail. He thought it would all be sorted out quickly. There were witnesses, there were cameras. Surely someone would tell the truth, but no one came forward. The bar's camera had been broken for months, and the people who had seen the fight had vanished by the time police started asking questions. James was charged with aggravated assault, and when he was assigned a public defender, he quickly realized how little effort was going into his defense. The lawyer barely asked him anything about what happened. His military service was mentioned once in passing but never brought up again. In court, the prosecution painted James as a violent man trained to kill, suggesting his combat experience made him dangerous. It was a horrible twist of truth, and James could only sit and listen as his years of service were turned against him. The trial lasted only 2 days. The jury didn't know who James really was. They only knew what they were told, and they believed it. James was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison. As the judge read the sentence, James felt like he was watching someone else's life crumble. He had fought for his country, followed the law, and tried to help, and now he was being punished for it. In a single moment, everything he had worked for, his career, his honor, his freedom, was taken away, and no one seemed to care almost. A year had passed since James Walker was sent to prison, and during that time he felt like the world had forgotten him. Each day bled into the next, a dull routine of silence, steel doors, and restless nights. He kept his head down, avoided fights, and clung to the hope that someday, someone would see that he didn't belong there. That hope finally sparked back to life the day a new judge was assigned to review a backlog of older cases in the district, including his. Her name was Maria Caldwell, a tough no-nonsense woman known for being fair. But what no one in the courtroom realized was that she had also once served as a legal officer in the military. She understood the weight of service, the sacrifices it demanded, and the damage that could be done when justice was denied. Judge Caldwell sat at her desk late one night, going over files that had been passed around and mostly ignored. When she opened James Walker's case, something didn't sit right. The charge was severe, but the evidence was paper-thin. She read the original police report 3 times and noticed how one-sided it was. There were no fingerprints taken from the knife, no CCTV footage, no witness statements, and almost no mention of James's military record. She checked deeper into the victim and was stunned to find multiple assault charges both before and after the incident with James, some of which were never brought up during the trial. The more she read, the angrier she became. She couldn't believe that a man with James's background had been convicted so quickly and harshly based on such a flimsy account. She decided to call a hearing and ordered that James be brought back into court. On the day of the hearing, James stood in front of her, wearing the same faded prison jumpsuit he'd worn for nearly a year. He looked thinner, older, like the weight of the injustice had drained the life from him. But even so, he stood tall, his back straight, his eyes calm. Judge Caldwell looked at him, then at the stack of paperwork on her desk. She flipped through it slowly, shaking her head. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I've read this entire file, front to back, and I have one question that I can't get out of my head." She paused, looking around the courtroom, then back at James. "Why is this Marine still in jail?" The room was dead silent. The prosecutor fumbled for words, but nothing came out. James's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in months, someone had spoken up for him. Before anyone could respond, the courtroom doors creaked open. A man in a dark suit walked in briskly, carrying a folder. Behind him came 2 Marines in uniform and a woman holding a camera bag. All eyes turned toward them as they approached the bench. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised by the interruption, but allowed them to come forward. What happened next would change everything. The courtroom, once quiet and tense, suddenly felt electric as the group approached the bench. The man in the dark suit introduced himself as David Kim, an independent investigator and former Marine himself. Beside him were Sergeant Miller and Captain Reyes. Both had served with James Walker in Afghanistan. The woman with the camera bag was a local journalist named Emily Ross, who had been following James's story for months after receiving an anonymous tip. David handed Judge Caldwell the thick folder he was carrying. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "this folder contains new evidence that proves Lance Corporal James Walker is innocent and that the original trial was a failure of justice." Judge Caldwell took the folder and began flipping through it, eyes narrowing as she read. Inside were statements from multiple witnesses who had been at the bar that night, people the original defense never contacted. One bartender said she saw the real attacker pull the knife first and that James had stepped in to stop what could have become a deadly assault. Another customer had even filmed part of the fight on an old cell phone. The footage had been deleted, but was recently recovered by a tech expert working with Emily. The video showed exactly what James had described: a chaotic fight, a knife flashing, and James disarming the man and pinning him to the ground, not out of aggression but to protect. Others. The judge motioned for the courtroom monitor to be turned on. The video was played in full. Gasps echoed through the room as the footage made it clear James had been telling the truth all along. Even the prosecutor looked stunned, flipping through his notes, realizing how badly the case had been handled. Judge Caldwell's face hardened. As she watched, David pointed to additional documents. "This includes the criminal history of the so-called victim," he said. "He's been arrested twice since James went to prison, both times for violent behavior. One of those incidents happened at the very same bar." James stood motionless, afraid to believe what was happening. His hands trembled slightly as the room erupted into murmurs. For nearly a year, he had been labeled a criminal. Now, the truth was out there for everyone to see. Judge Caldwell took a deep breath and looked directly at him. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I am deeply sorry for what has been done to you." She turned to the court. "This is not just a mistake. This is a failure of the justice system, and it must be corrected immediately. This man should have never been in jail." With a bang of her gavel, she overturned the conviction on the spot. The guards removed James's handcuffs. For a moment he just stood there, stunned. Then, slowly, he smiled for the first time in nearly a year. He was free not just from prison, but from the lie that had stolen his life. James Walker stepped out of the courthouse and into the sunlight, blinking as if he hadn't seen the sky in years. In some ways, he hadn't. The world outside the prison walls felt bigger, brighter, and almost unreal. A small crowd had gathered, some former Marines, others strangers who had read Emily Ross's story when it went viral days earlier. People held signs that read "Welcome Home, Hero and Justice for James." Applause broke out as he walked down the steps, still in the loose-fitting prison clothes but no longer wearing chains. James paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the noise and kindness. He had imagined this day so many times, but now that it was real, he didn't know what to feel. Anger, gratitude, confusion, hope, they all hit him at once. Emily approached him, quietly, her eyes warm. "You're okay?" she asked gently. James nodded, not trusting his voice yet. "You gave me my life back," he finally said. She shook her head. "You never lost it. They just tried to bury it." Beside her, David Kim handed James a folded American flag, his own, from his days in service. "You earned this more than I ever did," he said with quiet respect. That simple gesture meant more to James than words could express. In the weeks that followed, James began putting the pieces of his life back together. It wasn't easy. His home had been sold, his bank account was empty, and many people still only remembered the headlines from the day he was arrested. But something inside him refused to stay broken. With Emily's help, he gave interviews that reached millions. People began to understand the full story, not just of a Marine wrongfully imprisoned, but of a justice system that often failed those who had sacrificed the most. James used the spotlight not for revenge but for purpose. He teamed up with David and Emily to start a non-profit dedicated to helping wrongly accused veterans. They called it Honor-Bound. Their mission was simple: provide legal aid, mental health support, and advocacy for service members who had been overlooked or betrayed. Within months, they had taken on their first 3 cases, and each time James sat across from a struggling veteran, he saw a version of himself and promised to fight like someone had fought for him. 1 year later, on the 4th of July, James stood on a stage at a Veterans Memorial Park, now wearing a crisp Marine dress uniform, again borrowed for the day until his own could be restored. The crowd stretched far across the grass, families waving flags, children on shoulders, veterans with tears in their eyes. As fireworks burst overhead, James stepped up to the microphone. "I lost everything," he said plainly, "but I found something more powerful than hate or anger. I found people who still believe in justice, people who don't give up." The crowd erupted in applause as the final firework lit up the sky. James looked up and smiled, on just because he was free, but because now he had purpose. His story had almost ended in silence, but instead it ended in light. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard.